So, massive content warning for discussions of grooming, victim blaming, pedophilia, gaslighting, and abuse. If these are particularly hard subjects for you and they hit a little too close to home, there's no problem in backing out and closing the video and maybe coming back to something less serious that I'm covering. Secondly, do not harass this individual I'm covering. In fact, it would probably give her more of a victim complex if you did so. So, let's not do that today, alright? Cool. Let's get on with this. Hi-ho hell fucking oh. I really wish I didn't have to keep doing these more serious commentaries lately, but I personally just couldn't stand by seeing this all go down and not throwing my 2 cents into the ring. So, what am I talking about today? Well, we are talking about Diddytones. Wait, I mean Doodle Tones. Why? Oh, that's pretty fucking easy. If y'all have been keeping up with Blue Sky or Twitter or whatever the fuck platform you're on, you'll know more information has come out about Doodle Tones and former commentator Horace Tome. Said info being that Horace Tome, formerly known as George Raccoon, actually is a groomer! And worse yet, Susanne thought it would be a great idea to defend him, despite the document having incredibly concrete evidence of his grooming and emotionally manipulative behaviors. Some additional preamble here too, that I believe is important, is that some people mentioned through the document and the video go by different names than they did before, and one of them in particular is just straight up dead. So to run through them quickly, here's some text on the screen to show who is who. Alright, so let's begin with the public execution. Shall we?
God, this video terrifies me.
You should be.
Before you jump to a conclusion, please hear me out. October 6th, 2019, the slideshow commentary community was hit with a document posted by user Channel Gray, written by an ex-user Leo or whatever, detailing their experience talking with ex-commentator George Raccoon. This experience, explaining how they felt groomed by George, was the first time in recent memory that the SCC ever dealt with an expose in a typical cancel culture way. In retort, instead of defending himself, George left the internet, presumably admitting to his guilt, depending on who you ask. To most people in this community, that was the end of it. George fucked off, the groomer was gone, and Leo was deemed a hero. However, I wasn't happy, because I didn't believe George groomed Leo. I initially tried voicing this belief on a live stream when tensions were high, and botched it all up. I put way too much of an onus on Leo, who had believed they were groomed, which to everyone else looked like I was blatantly victim blaming.
Foreshadowing is a literary device. No, but in all seriousness, I don't think you were raked over the fiery fucking coals enough for that stream, nor should you have been allowed to be on your platform in the CC after that. And to add on here, just so we can put a pin in it, Susie says that she put way too much of an onus onto Leo, the victim, who was still a minor when he was victimized by George. That wouldn't be looking like victim blaming, it is victim blaming, you fucking donut!
Which was understandable. I took the massive L and apologized for it, and then stayed silent about it publicly until fairly recently, when I started getting tired of hearing how someone who I didn't believe was a groomer was falsely labeled as such.
Falsely. Falsely? Dog, it wasn't like Leo's dog was just mere conjecture. There were literal screenshots that corroborated his testimony, clearly showing that George sent videos of his kink to Leo. Said kink being magic tricks, mainly disappearing tricks. To which, I need to ask you a question at this point. The fuck was your thought process? Because once again, Leo was 16 and George was 24.
Santa's #1 helper is a squirrel.
I would really prefer if you would be quiet.
But with that said, the accusations are that George, who was in his 20s, led an at-the-time minor on his NSFW-ish account. He would draw his friends, including said minor, in Snow White dresses, which were a fetish of his, send pictures of himself wearing said dress to the minor, this was seen as him being sexual, would constantly pester the minor, who, should also mention at this point, was trans, into wearing said dress, which was uncomfortable for them, came back to doing all this stuff after being confronted about it initially, sent videos of magic tricks to a minor, magic tricks being another fetish of his. After Leo broke off the friendship with George, he had blown up in their DMs with a lot of concerning self-destructive messages, and blatantly admitted to grooming Leo.
You know, something seems like, I don't know, off about some parts of this actually. I can't put my finger on it, but yes, I can! So, the way that you present the evidence from the doc here is incredibly dishonest, because you only present the testimony and not the evidence that would further support it with what Leo provided.
Wow, these accusations seem rather damning, right? It's cut and dry. That should be the end of it. Video over. George groomed Leo. Roll credits. Except this is when I scream in frustration at how quickly people were to believe these accusations, especially in 2019, a year after the Spockter theory situation happened.
Holy fuck! Not every situation that involves an allegation of sex crimes or things of that sort is going to be the exact same as the Spockter 2018 situation. Because at that point in time, there actually was evidence proving his innocence with the claims levied at him by Pendergrain, Atari, and Stories. Links to Ponder's video from back then will be in description. Like, yes, people should think critically and look into the document and read it, of course. But at the same time, Suzanne, if you looked through the doc, you would know at even a cursory glance that George was absolutely guilty.
So let's go over what is and isn't true within this document, starting with something that is objectively true, because I do want to go into this as unbiased as humanly possible. I won't be able to go into it fully unbiased, of course, but, you know, I'll give it a fair chance. George did let Leo onto his NSFW-ish account. So, to elaborate, as someone who also followed that account at the time, George had a specific account where he could share more adult themes to his friends who were more comfortable with it. There wasn't anything necessarily explicit ever posted on there, I want to assure you, and
yeah, except for his fucking kinks that were specifically sexually gratifying to him. Not anything explicit. Like, holy fuck, how are you somehow denser than a mixture of cement and pig shit? While kink can absolutely not be sexual in some cases with some people who may be asexual or not, having an interest in the subject of the kink divorced from sexual gratification, however, I would like to point out that George did find his kinks to be something that get him off, so, fuck off.
this was detailed out the gate for anyone who followed that account, as the pinned tweet had this image directly connect to it.
See, it's funny that you pull up this image, yet it still proves that these kinks he has do get his rocks off, so really, what does this image being on screen actually disprove? Oh wait, I know! Nothing!
You may be noticing some other things on here that'll be important later, and don't worry, we'll come back to them. The important part of this image at the moment, though, is rule number 1. Porn and nudity will not be retweeted on here. So nothing that George shared directly was NSFW.
Come on. Come the fuck on!
So in that sense, he was fine. However, considering that he did label it as NSFW-ish, that's still arguably not exactly okay, and as someone who's kept in touch with him for all this time, yes, even he acknowledges in hindsight this was not okay.
Why are you talking to somebody who was publicly outed for grooming and emotional manipulation? Like, this takes a disgusting amount of willful blindness and recklessness to do that. Like, it's not even just infuriating, it's also just incredibly disturbing. Like, this goes back to a previous point made, but to have gotten those screenshots of the testimony, you would have had to look through the document. Ergo, you would have seen him clear as day grooming Leo. I'm killing myself.
So sure, in that sense, George was irresponsible. Not to the extent he should be ostracized and crucified for it, personally, I'd argue, but definitely should have been informed that this was not okay.
Except for the fact that he was warned and talked to in this regards to the Snow White dress drawing incident, but we'll get to that later.
So with that out of the way, I would also like to confirm something else explained in Leo's document, being that George did have a habit of self-destructing at the time, and I think just about everyone who was friends with him at the time had told him that this was a problem at some point. So him going into Leo's DMs in the screenshots we do see towards the end of the document are kinda on brand. This is also something I'd argue shouldn't be a huge strike against George though, as we don't see him doing it maliciously in the screenshots we get.
Okay, but making that statement is blatantly disregarding the fact that he melted down and self-destructed when he wasn't getting his way, a behavior that was a persistent problem throughout all of his time in the CC. He had a particularly nasty habit of melting down whenever his vents were not responded to, and he also melted down whenever someone didn't reply to him.
In fact, everything that George says in those screenshots are evidence more against the idea that he was doing it to be purposely manipulative, as his messages say that he fucked up, and that Leo shouldn't feel bad or concerned about anything he was saying, trying to reassure Leo that they can move on.
Actually, no, this is a form of manipulation, because he's basically doing the "don't cry for me, I'm already dead" bullshit. I also find it quite interesting that you didn't bring up the message spamming from George either. That also reads as incredibly manipulative, because it's basically just trying to throw a pity party for himself while simultaneously trying to say that it isn't as a means to guilt Leo.
But did George have any reason to feel as such? Well, this is why this video exists, because I plan to make the argument that no, I don't think he should. Now, mind you, I'm not an expert. I should get that out of the gate.
Which is exactly why you shouldn't have even tried to touch this case with a 10-foot fucking pole, but hey, c'est la vie.
Merely giving my thoughts and feelings on this 2-year-old situation, and why I disagreed with the common consensus. Whether or not you think I'm right or wrong by the end of it is entirely up to you. If your mind's made up, it's made up. I won't fight you on it. And as such, I want to stress to not go out and harass the individuals involved in this situation, especially given what I have to say about the situation by the end of it all. One, because, yeah, this drama is about 2 years old, and
okay, calling a situation that involves grooming and emotional abuse drama is vile because it downplays the severity and also disregards how delicate something like this should be handled. Delete your account! Oh wait, you've already done that.
Most everyone has moved on. 2, nobody, no matter how heinous their actions are, deserves harassment, contrary to the popular belief. And 3, because harassing people is lame. Plain and simple. So now that I have the formalities out of the way, let's begin with the first part of the grooming allegation, the Snow White dress. So, something to note about George is that his favorite Disney princess is Snow White, and apparently in accordance to Leo, he and George would bond over their mutual appreciation for the character. Leo would allow George to draw their character wearing the dress of the titular character, and didn't see anything wrong with it until Gwen, another character in this story.
In a similar essence to my previous interjection, calling Amity a character is honestly just fucking dehumanizing, when she was actually another victim of George's, and is also not just some antagonist or character, and is a fully fleshed out human being, you stupid bitch.
Informed Leo that the dress was a kink of George's, and that George was forbidden to draw anything regarding Leo in her dress. But, hold on. George's aforementioned rules bulletin explicitly mentions that he doesn't see Snow White as a kink of his.
It's not a kink, but it is something he still finds appealing and will still intermingle with his other kinks. Oh, you want proof? Here's some proof. Here's George mentioning that he's wearing the dress while watching a video of a disappearing magic trick. So, in other words, him drawing a minor with a Snow White dress as well as wanting said minor to wear that dress is still incredibly bad.
This was established on his NSFW-ish account from the beginning. So for Leo to sit there and believe something that was blatantly against that established descriptor feels kind of sketchy to me.
At this point, you are arguing semantics for the sake of defending your groomer bestie. Delete your account, Vigelsio 2.0.
Especially when Leo follows up explaining this to the reader that if you ask George about Snow White being a kink of his, he'd deny it, which always struck me as strange. To sit here and preemptively revoke any further discussion on this kind of topic by making such a blanket and certain statement claiming the subject to be a liar when the information they give doesn't match your own feels, ironically enough, like a lie in of itself.
Yeah, no, if anybody's lying, it's George, because he promised he wouldn't try to draw Leo in the Snow White dress again after being talked to by Amity. Only for him to, well, go back on that promise to her and Leo and draw him in the dress. Ergo, a fucking lie!
The tone of this document is to inform or educate people on your own experiences with an individual you claim to have groomed you. But as much as it typically isn't what people want to hear, there usually is two sides to a story such as this. And without the proper evidence to prove that your opposition has a behavioral pattern with lying or manipulation, this kind of claim feels more like its sole purpose is to shine a much more malicious light on your target instead of giving out the truth.
How else do you expect a victim to come out about their groomer? What, to play nice and say good shit about them to counterbalance all the repugnant shit? No, fuck off. Like, I'm saying this out there to the audience. If you're speaking up about somebody who hurt you, don't try softening the blow. They hurt you immensely and do not deserve such a luxury.
Or at the very least, a believable testimony, which isn't something you would want to do if your goal is to educate people on a groomer in the community.
The goal wasn't to educate, the goal was to get what George did to him out there into the public's knowledge to steer clear of him. This isn't a lecture that's meant to be palatable and clean, Susanne. This is a victim's testimony. Please uproot your head from your colon and clean the shit out of your ears.
But to me, it doesn't have to be a straight-up sexual thing, because it is clearly something he finds appealing. I'd also like to directly respond to this, because I find it to be frustrating. This claim would only be valid if we were to be under the prenotion that George's appreciation for Snow White was sexual in nature, which, as I demonstrated, I don't have any reason to believe is the case, and with that, George could find this dress to be an aesthetic appeal, or maybe an appeal to nostalgia, or literally any other appeal that you could look at that's used in art and advertising.
Except when you mentioned it earlier that it wasn't, so, shut up.
Appeal doesn't have to be sexual. This is again unfortunate to this document because anyone who thinks about this for longer than a minute tops could come to the same conclusion.
And anybody who thinks longer than 5 seconds can already see this is total bullshit for one reason. Yes, appeal doesn't have to be sexual, but it can still be sexual! These things aren't mutually exclusive, fuckface! Especially in George's case, where it absolutely did have sexual undertones to it. I'm starting to think you only selectively process the information and then gaslight yourself into thinking this whack-ass, bass-ackwards logic makes any modicum of sense.
I like to draw hoodies on my characters that don't typically have them and call them cool jackets because they're fun and there's an appeal in drawing that. That doesn't mean hoodies turn me on. Get real.
Nope, your false equivalency bullshit isn't gonna fly by me either, especially since in that case, the appeal wouldn't be sexual and would just be a matter of character design preference, unlike George's appeal to Snow White dresses, which is clearly sexual. So no, Diddytones, you get real!
Anyway, then Leo explains that Gwen chewed George out about it. George backed down from drawing Leo in a Snow White dress, probably intimidated by Gwen if I'm to be honest, though of course, that would be something you'd have to ask the supposed groomer in this scenario. And then cut to 2 years later in 2019. George winds up drawing Leo in a Snow White dress twice. Leo goes on to make the theory that it's because by this point they didn't hang out with Gwen anymore, and George, quote-unquote, knew he wouldn't be called out about it. And I'm so glad Leo clarified it as such, because otherwise it would heavily look like a narrative was being spun to ruin someone, and we definitely wouldn't want that. But in reality, could we not make the argument that George just forgot about what happened 2 years prior?
I don't know. Forgetting about an express boundary that was made clear as day doesn't seem all that plausible in that situation, because somebody's boundaries, when it is of a sexual nature or whatnot, is pretty fucking important and would be pretty damn hard to forget. But this highlights one of the key aspects of grooming, ignoring and overstepping boundaries or just overstepping on somebody because they know that their target won't say anything. With Amity not being in contact with Leo at the time of this and George knowing, it's a pretty easy deduction to make that he did this thinking he could get away with it, which is gross.
Leo doesn't clarify that there was any conversation regarding the two of them that would have reminded George of the conversation in question, so this is again, at best, just an assumption on Leo's end that paints George in a much different light than what might have been the actual truth of the matter. Plus, Leo even tells us following this that George asked to draw the first piece for them, so even if he did remember, maybe he wanted to see if the opinion on the matter changed from whatever Gwen might have talked to George about, since we also didn't get that side of the story.
Dog, waiting for opinions to change is crazy! Like, especially since this is a minor we're talking about here too, like, a groomer, quote-unquote, waiting for options to change, or quote-unquote, gauging someone's tolerance, are typical grooming and predatory tactics. Like, look through the doc and actually use your eyes and not your ass.
Was instead just told to get it through Gwen's at the time Twitter handle. Following this, there's an explanation of George's self-destructive behavior, before going on to justify that as the reason Leo said yes to everything that George did. And it's here that I really start questioning matters, because throughout the entire document, there's not a whole lot of screenshots to help Leo's case, and Leo does explain that because George deleted everything, they didn't exactly have the time or ability to screen cap everything that they thought was important.
That's cool and everything, but I regret to inform you, not really, that once again, you are fucking wrong, because there was absolutely evidence of George blowing up in the self-destructive way as a means to emotionally manipulate Leo. Evidence that you don't even fucking present, and also, like, tell me, if you were in Leo's position as a minor with some creepy-ass adult who can't seem to not be inappropriate with you and will melt down and crash out every time you don't indulge in his fucking kinks or what have you, wouldn't you be afraid to try and be honest with someone like George? Like, oh my god, you lack so much basic empathy and understanding that I am genuinely wondering how you even burrowed your way into this community.
And like, okay, I get that. But when the screenshots that you do share are just you happily nodding to everything and getting excited that George drew you in a Snow White dress while simultaneously telling us, the reader, that you were uncomfortable about it all, then pardon me for looking at this whole situation skeptically. Did George know that these images made you uncomfortable? Did you tell him they did? Because even in accordance to your own document, that doesn't seem to be the case. You tell us that you said it was okay before going on your own self-deprecating tirade about the fact that you'll throw yourself to the dogs for your friends. And I'd even be able to give the benefit of doubt in saying that you could have felt uncomfortable about it all in hindsight, but then not only would that be a lie because you actively told us that your mind wandered to the aforementioned conversation with Gwen, but also, that's in hindsight. This wouldn't change the reaction we see in the screenshots that Leo gave us that would have given George the idea that this was not only okay, but encouraged. Oh,
there are so many fucking problems here that I genuinely think it would be like several episodes of Hoarders but buried alive. That being said, let's fucking sift through the dumpster and find out which pieces of mold-infested filth need to be burned. So yeah, like explained earlier, this doesn't really contradict his testimony, since he explains his reasoning behind not pushing back more against George, and even then, I would like to point out that the responsibility is not on Leo in the slightest, and in fact, is on the grown-ass man-child for being overtly sexual and overtly using grooming tactics. As far as your point being uncomfortable with things in hindsight, do you realize what can of worms you've opened? And do you realize what you just fucking said? Of course, these are both rhetorical questions, so let's stop dicking around here and get straight to it. It is actually a fairly common experience for victims of grooming or predation in general, really, to not realize abuse is happening or has happened, because while from a view of hindsight or a view from a third party looking from the outside in, it is plain as day, the whole point of these tactics being used is to be covert to their targets, because groomers are insidious manipulators by nature. So by that logic, you making a big stink about Leo being unnerved and made uncomfortable in hindsight, and that somehow invalidating his claims about George is not only stupid, but also revolting! Because this is actually just really poorly and really thinly veiled victim blaming at its fucking finest here. Now, you might be wondering over the course of this video how I know about this subject so well, and that's a completely fair question to ask. That being said, I know all of this because I have been groomed twice, and I didn't fully realize it until leaving that old friend group and doing a lot of introspection. And that, of course, I've seen and heard many cases like this, whether it was online or through court cases and what have you.
but Doodle, are you trying to say that it's Leo's fault he was groomed? No.
Yes, Diddytones, that is what I'm saying.
I'm saying this isn't grooming at all. A very common tactic of grooming is testing the boundaries to figure out how you can push past them to get into a sexual context. For another example, and I apologize in advance for using an actual instance of grooming as an example. I'm aware of how tasteless this could come off, but I feel it's important to show that what it would look like had George actually been trying to groom Leo in a situation such as this, since our community actually has an example. So, let's talk about V Omega. V Omega was outed not even a full year after George's allegations by Joni Ruin at Twitlonger. This post outlined that V was an abusive, controlling, transphobic groomer, and I will happily concur to those labels. I'll be talking my experience with them in another video if it's not already out, because I'll have to then. I'll leave a link below to the full Twitlonger if you wish to read up on it all, but the particular centerpiece that I want to look at, of course, is the grooming allegations. Though, while Joni didn't exactly have any screenshots relating to that particular allegation and was much more focused on V's abusive behavior, V sure as hell was willing to give them in a now deleted Twitter thread he was making responding to it all. Luckily, I have the important receipts. So, here's a screenshot that V took of their DMs from January of 2018. You can see here that V and Joni are talking about pornography, with Joni explicitly saying that she was not one to look at pornography. By April of the same year, the topic was brought up again, with Joni admitting to sometimes looking at specifically furry porn. By March of the next year, while we don't see the fullest extent of this screenshot, we can see that Joni was all for talking about pornography, showing that V's attempt to wear down her boundaries was, unfortunately, grossly successful. The fucking creep. But we don't see that with George. We're only told that through the lens of Leo, and even through that lens we can see that Leo never vocalized these feelings.
Okay, but who else's lens are we supposed to view this through? The mailman? Super Mario? Your mother? Alright, but really, comparing one grooming victim story to another grooming victim story is absolutely distasteful, because you are using somebody else's abuse and grooming to then try and debunk someone else's grooming, especially since these stories are far more different from each other than you'd think. Like, Joni was 17 and V was 19, which is absolutely vile. But Leo was 16 and George was 24. That is an even more egregious age gap. And just so wires aren't crossed, I'm not invalidating what happened to Joni, but just highlighting the age gap between Leo and George was even more revolting. That all being said, there actually is one commonality. Both V and George pushed their sexual interest onto children, you fucking idiot.
Hey, Postpoint Lucy here, recording this at 5:06 in the fucking morning. Kill me. Anyway, I thought I would let y'all know that Susie's also just flat out wrong here as well on another end, given the fact that Joni's document actually did have screenshots and will be linked in the description. So, God, fucking Suzanne, you are a fucking donut.
Plus, I want to point out that these drawings that Leo alluded to being a source of George's grooming. Even if they were sexual, it wasn't exclusive to Leo, which also puts into question how much of this could actually be considered as such. I've mentioned this in my Sherman videos before, but grooming is a targeted action. Sure, you could argue someone can groom more than one person, but when George is making these kinds of images for anyone who's his friend above just a selection of people, then I'm sorry. Even if these had sexual undertones, it would just be grossly irresponsible and inappropriate at worst.
Kinks, or something that intermingles with kinks, being made for other people who are consenting adults that are the same thing as what was used to groom a kid, doesn't negate the fact that it was still drawn and sent to a minor. Ergo, just because your groomer friend decided to draw Snow White for you and your OCs, doesn't mean that it was still wildly inappropriate to expose and condition Leo to something that George finds appeal in conjunction with his already established sexual preferences and kinks, to which I may remind you the base definition of grooming is to prepare someone for a role through covert and manipulative means. With this case being sexual grooming, especially shown with these screenshots up here on screen, where he continuously asks Leo about finding the dress that was a Halloween costume he wore when he was 8. What the fuck? Or in these screenshots where George sends Leo an Amazon link to a Snow White dress and tells Leo that he believes in him, that his parents would buy it or get it for him. So yeah, try again.
Now, let's look at the spin-off to this allegation. George bought his own Snow White dress to wear, posted pictures on his NSFW-ish Twitter, and allegedly gave Leo some pictures of his own whilst pestering Leo to wear them themselves. I really don't know what more to say. This is just more of the same, unfortunately. Leo goes around painting Snow White as one of George's kinks, which has been put into question. Leo makes a very extreme statement claiming that George was sending him pictures of himself wearing the outfit directly, making the claim. The number of photos I got from him wearing the dress was almost 10 times the amount that he posted on his timeline. It very much became a weekly thing for him to do. He would send me 5 or more pictures of him in the dress and ask me for compliments, my overall thoughts, and if he looked cute/pretty. This is then followed by 0 screenshots of George doing this, and being probably the most frustrating example at the lack of screenshots being an issue with this document. Like, I can concede to the idea that maybe Leo wasn't able to get everything. Fine. Like, I'm not even saying that if Leo doesn't have every receipt in the world that these allegations should be put under extreme scrutiny. And I can accept the lack of evidence to a degree. But Leo is making such an enormous claim here, alluding to George explicitly targeting them, and if there were that many instances of George doing this, why don't we even see one of them? You were able to get a screen cap between you and George talking about a dress, again with the problem of you visually not setting any boundaries for George to push, but I think I've hammered that in enough. But with the evidence showing George sending direct pics of him wearing the Snow White dress, it doesn't exist. Why? This is one of your biggest allegations and easily one of your most damning ones to boot.
Because he didn't have time to get everything, because George nuked this account, dipshit. Something you just waffled on about multiple times and then flip-flopped on whether it affects the validity of Leo's claims about George. Like, pick a fucking struggle!
Anyway, following this, we then get the dysphoria conversation, Leo being an NB trans mask, and this one's a bit more of a gray area. I'm not going to put into question whether dresses do or don't give Leo dysphoria. That is not my place to say. I'm also not entirely too sure whether George did or didn't know whether Leo gets this way about dresses in particular.
While there isn't a screenshot, I do love how you just willfully omit another section of Leo's testimony to try and better suit your deranged narrative. What am I talking about specifically? What I'm talking about specifically is where Leo notes that George, as well as many others, had followed his vent account on Twitter at the time, where he says he's vented about the dresses on numerous occasions and that George was following it. Want to explain that to the class, Susanne? Or are you gonna stay mute and shake like a little bitch?
If George did know, then fuck, that's tone deaf as hell, and this could also go on the record as another one of George's actual transgressions. Get it? If he didn't, then I can't really get onto his case about it, especially since Leo doesn't show his discomfort in the screenshots, and either way, this would be he said, she said effectively. Still not grooming, mind you, but also not particularly great had George been guilty of knowingly setting off Leo's dysphoria. The continual excuse of, but George would beat himself up also doesn't exactly help matters either, because I get it, but those boundaries not being set doesn't give me any reason to believe George's intentions with these conversations are more malicious than two friends bonding over a common interest.
This wasn't bonding over the same interest. This was a man who was indulging in things that got him off to a minor. Delete your account.
I don't want to seem dismissive about these claims, because I can't know how Leo actually felt about these conversations. For all I know, he could have been uncomfortable, and also, I get how important it is to believe a victim of abuse. Plus, yeah, not every victim of abuse will know they're being abused. But it's hard to see George as an abuser when zero boundaries were initially drawn, and instead Leo willingly partook in these conversations, leading into what we are to believe to be George's desires.
No, not really, especially since all Leo's doc outed George to be was a groomer and an emotional manipulator. And while these are forms of abuse, and you could get on me for being quote-unquote pedantic, the words we use to describe things and whatnot in situations like these are important and have power and have a heavy meaning to them. Also, still no mention or proper glance at George sending Leo videos of magic tricks, or hell, even the evidence of that drawing of the Delcota disappearing trick was at least done or being made or was going to be made of Leo's OC. Kinda odd.
Leo's words paint one picture, whereas what we can see in the screenshots paints a totally contradictory one, and we're just supposed to believe these images are one of the same. We're not done, by the way. We still have the claim of magic tricks to talk about, and out the gate, I'm screaming. One of the first things you'll notice when going on his NSFW is his pinned tweet that you are encouraged to read before interacting with his page. It was there that he detailed the things that he found sexually appealing, aka his kinks and a few rules of the account. I'm sorry? So, Leo is willing to detail what was in that pinned tweet. He even goes on to explicitly mention the Delcota chair trick, George's favorite magic trick as outlined by his rules bulletin, but will conveniently leave out the section of Snow White when talking about that. I want to make it clear that I'm not out here trying to pin Leo as this bad person.
Except you are trying to call Leo some horrible person who is a liar, despite the fact that you forgot to take a good look in the mirror yourself, considering you actually are a horrible person and liar, as detailed earlier in this commentary. Like, I'm so tired of this thinly veiled bullshit. Like, this straight up reminds me of the whole fucking George Carlin bit of, well, I'm not robbing you, I'm just borrowing your wallet, or, well, I'm not a murderer, I'm just an ender of life, or, this isn't toilet paper, it's just bathroom tissues. Like, putting sprinkles on the proverbial shit sundae called your argument does nothing to disprove Leo's claims, and in fact makes you look infinitely worse due to willfully using dishonest tactics and framing to get your way.
But covering this document makes it really hard when stuff like this is scattered throughout the entire thing. It gets very blatant. But yeah, so George did have a thing for magic tricks, specifically the Delcota chair, and yes, he even described it as a kink. So we are getting into some arguably creepy territory, and hey, credit where it's due. Leo talks about how George sent some videos involving something he finds to be his kink, and then actually shows us George doing so. However, and this is where I must remind you all that I'm not an expert and am merely giving my 2 cents on the matter, grooming is usually done with the goal of sexual or financial satisfaction, and regardless of how creepy it may seem within the DMs, and you can definitely make an argument for it or against it being creepy, at the end of the day, I'm not going to fight a person one way or another about it.
Except when you did by cozying up the community to George for 2 years when there was some pushback, and also trying to do so on stream as well.
However, with the screenshots that we see in Leo's document, as much as they exist and show us that George did send these videos, the screenshots seem more conversational than sexual or malicious. The first one shows George sharing the Delcota chair trick performed by David Copperfield, before presumably going on to talk about the Snow White dress he bought for himself. By the way, cross-dressing in the way George was doing so is also not proof of George doing it to be sexual, just should get that out of the way.
A sexual conversation or conversation of a sexual nature can still be formatted as a quote-unquote conversational thing, because literally how else is a conversation supposed to go? Like, that being said, your point doesn't negate the fact that he still sent something that was sexually arousing to a kid, regardless if the conversation was flowing like a regular one. That's still really fucked up to do to a kid.
Look at him die!
Ugh. At the end of the day, to recap, do I think George groomed Leo? No. Do I think George was irresponsible? Absolutely. Do I think this document does its job properly? No. Do I think Leo should have drawn boundaries with George sooner? Yes. Do I think Leo is a bad person? No. Do I believe Leo was a victim? Well, personally speaking, yes. That last one might be a bit of a confusing statement to make, what with everything I outlined today, but if you'll allow me, I have been thinking about this document a lot, and as I said earlier, I don't believe Leo wrote this document with the goal to purposely ruin George's friendships or reputation in the community. The language used within this document seems more concerned and scared than anything else, almost as if somebody else implanted the belief that this behavior was grooming. And we know that there is, considering Gwen's reaction to George drawing people in Snow White dresses was to directly tell Leo not to allow George to do that, plus the conversation George and Leo had breaking it off. Now, perhaps I'm thinking too deep into it. Perhaps this is a bit conspiratorial.
Because it is conspiratorial. Because Amy's reaction to hearing that George was going to draw Leo in the Snow White dress, something that goes hand in hand with his case, is the fucking normal response, especially since Leo was 16. Like, the way this was detailed in Leo's testimony wasn't like Amity was plotting with Leo to ruin George. It was literally Amity informing Leo that the dress was something that was appealing to him. You still haven't changed anything.
At the end of the day, this is speculation, so take this section with more of a grain of salt. However, I just can't get over that last portion. Leo's last DM with George, where he starts the conversation telling George that some other people brought up that George was grooming him. I'm not going to say who, because that's not important. I don't believe that. So throughout Leo's document, Charlie or Channel Gray and Gwen are constantly alluded to as people that Leo was super close to. Coming from someone who was also friends with the both of them for a brief period of time though, they both had a history of not liking George. So back in mid-2018, I think, George actually initially wrote a document about Channel Gray being abusive towards him, with Gwen following in this abuse. In this document, George outlined how Gray would get overly aggressive at the most menial of transgressions, how they had a mentality that you had to immediately change or fuck off and get thrown out of the group or thrown out of chats, how Charlie in particular was kind of a two-faced individual who'd be quick to turn on those they had a problem with, how Charlie had a complete disregard to mental disorders, how they had a tendency to start shit with other people, how confrontational they were about everything, even if it didn't really need to be a big of a deal, would actually guilt-trip those who cut them off. I can vouch for that one. Jesus, it really is like talking about the Omega all over again. But yes, Channel Gray was incredibly a toxic person who I would not put past to be the person implanting seeds in Leo's head about George grooming them. And with Gwen effectively being described in that document as Charlie's yes girl at the time, her backing Gray up on all this also doesn't exactly surprise me. It doesn't even touch on what they did to some of their other friends. Mind you, again, this part of my video is speculation to be honest, and I could be totally off base with this claim. All I know is that when you get a person who is willing to be this abusive and manipulative, and give them the idea that they could do something like this is an outcome that could be possible. But ultimately, I won't say for sure one way or another. I don't actually have evidence to back this up. On that note, I also won't say one way or another that George for sure wasn't guilty or wasn't innocent. I don't believe he's a groomer, personally. I don't think there was nearly enough evidence to say that he is. And I hope I was able to make my case clear enough for you guys to understand.
So that was just a whole lot of conspiratorial bullshit, but I'm about to drop some B-17 truth bombs on your ass. Just because a claim comes from, or might have possibly come from someone who is an abusive person, it still doesn't make them not right about something that can objectively be proven. Like, here's a hypothetical real quick. Vivian could point up at the sky during a sunny day and say that the sky is blue, something that is objectively true, and also isn't mutually exclusive from each other due to her being abusive, you twat. That being said, you are absolutely saying with your full chest that George was innocent and that George didn't groom Leo, and also in true dumbass fashion, you also decide to shift Leo's victimhood away from the focus of what George did to something you couldn't even fucking verify with your power bar plugs into itself giving infinite power having ass.
Maybe I've changed some minds. Maybe I've at least put another perspective on the situation. Maybe I'm totally off base with defending a groomer.
Okay, hold the fuck on, run that back.
Maybe I've changed some minds. Maybe I've at least put another perspective on the situation. Maybe I'm totally off base with defending a groomer.
You're not even trying to be slick with this anymore, are you? Good fucking god! In any case, this wasn't a maybe, it actually was you defending a groomer. Fuck off.
English, motherfucker, do you speak it?
Alright, so final thoughts. This heaping pile of festering disease-ridden bullshit with sprinkles and a cherry on top is so fucking bad. Like, you had blatant groomer apologia everywhere, with a side of victim blaming, a good help of sheer dumbassery, seasoned with way too much dishonesty, and let's not forget about the dessert of dehumanization all across the proverbial plate. This isn't just bad, this is just straight up revolting with all the dangerous rhetoric this video has spread to not only the inner walls of the CC, but also to other people going through their own abuse and grooming. Matter of fact, I know that. I saw this video back when I was 15. And then use the same arguments to myself to dismiss my own grooming and abuse. Like, anybody in the audience who might be going through a similar situation to what has been shown, I want you to know that it's not your fault if this happens to you. Especially since the onus and responsibility is strictly on the adult who shouldn't even be sexual towards or be discussing sexual topics with children. That all being said, Susanne, I fucking despise you for how much damage you have caused with this video, and not only just to me with it, but also the other people I'm friends with too. Like, you gaslit Amity, Autumn, and Donnie, who were victims of George just so you could get your groomer friend back in the community because you couldn't let go. And fucking then, had the audacity to chase off the victim and not the predator. How could you? How fucking could you? And it also doesn't help that you focused way less on the videos of his kink being sent and more on the Snow White dress that entire time, basically selectively taking out whatever bits of evidence shot you in the foot. At this rate, don't ever come back. Don't even show your face to me or the rest of this community ever again. Get your GED, get a job, and fuck off. That's all from me. I'm gonna go to bed and just cry now. Oh, and support Leo, Autumn, Amity, and Donnie. They need it. Give them all the love you can. Later.